It was a quiet, cold evening in the small town. The streetlights flickered gently as the hum of passing cars was the only sound in the air. Officer Jameson had just finished his last round and was ready to head home. He had been working for hours, patrolling the same streets, dealing with the same types of calls. Tonight, however, something felt different. The usual quiet was replaced with a sense of tension that seemed to hang in the air. As Officer Jameson drove along the main street, his eyes scanned the cars around him. He was looking for anything out of place. It wasn't that he was trying to be suspicious. It was just his training and experience kicking in. A car speeding past caught his eye, and instinctively, he flicked on his sirens and turned his lights on, signaling for the driver to pull over. The car slowed down and moved to the side of the road, its headlights glowing in the night. Officer Jameson parked his patrol car behind it, ready to approach the vehicle. He reached for his flashlight, checking the rearview mirror and adjusting his cap before stepping out of his car. The driver hadn't done anything particularly dangerous, but Officer Jameson had a feeling, an instinct that told him this stop wasn't going to be as ordinary as it seemed. He walked up to the car, shining his flashlight into the window. He could make out the face of a man sitting behind the wheel. The man appeared calm, but Officer Jameson couldn't help but notice that he was black. It was a small detail, but in Jameson's mind, it added to the tension of the situation. He had seen this type of driver before, the ones who often didn't follow the rules, the ones who thought they were above the law. He pushed the thought away, reminding himself to stay professional. "Good evening, sir. I pulled you over for speeding," Jameson said as he leaned down to speak through the window. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply nodded slowly and reached for his license and registration. Officer Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that the man was too calm, almost too composed for someone who had just been pulled over. The officer could sense something was off. He watched the man's every movement carefully as the man handed over his documents. There was no rush in his actions, no sign of anxiety. Jameson took a moment to glance at the driver's face, reading it like he had learned to do over his years in the force. But the face before him didn't match the usual reactions he was used to seeing. There was no fear, no anger, no hesitation, just a calm, almost unsettling stillness. As Jameson took the papers from the man's hand, he glanced at the car's interior. Nothing unusual, yet something still bothered him. The way the man sat, the way he held himself, it was as if he were completely unfazed by the situation. Officer Jameson shifted his weight to one foot, standing tall as he waited for the man to speak or offer some sort of excuse. "I'm just doing my job," Officer Jameson thought, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling rising in his chest. He had been in situations before where things didn't go according to plan, and something inside told him that this was going to be one of those nights. As Officer Jameson stood by the car, holding the license and registration, the silence between him and the driver felt heavier than it should have been. The man had handed over his papers without a word, his movements slow and deliberate. Jameson couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something more to this situation than just a simple traffic stop. The driver didn't fidget or seem nervous in any way, which was unusual for someone who had just been pulled over. Most people either acted defensive or tried to explain themselves immediately, but not this man. He sat there, his hands still resting on the wheel, his face calm, as though he were simply waiting for the officer to finish his task. Jameson was trained to notice details like this, and this man's lack of reaction was making him suspicious. But what bothered Jameson the most was the fact that the man wasn't acting like a typical driver he'd stopped before. Jameson glanced down at the papers in his hands and then back at the man sitting in the car. He didn't recognize the name on the license, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. This town wasn't exactly a bustling metropolis, and he wasn't likely to run into the same people often. But the sense of unease gnawed at him. There was something about the way the man held himself, something that didn't quite fit with the typical response he saw when pulling someone over. The officer cleared his throat, trying to ease the tension he felt building inside him. "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked, keeping his voice steady, trying not to sound too curious. It was a standard question he asked everyone, hoping to keep things professional, but his tone was sharper than he intended. The man in the car looked up at him, almost as if he were contemplating the question. He spoke slowly, his voice calm and steady. "Just heading home," he said simply, his words matching the calm demeanor he had maintained since the moment the officer approached the vehicle. Jameson nodded, still unsure of what to make of this encounter. He didn't like being suspicious without cause, but something in his gut was telling him to keep digging. It was as if the man was hiding something, though Jameson couldn't place exactly what that might be. Trying to break the tension, the officer forced a smile and returned the papers to the man, his eyes lingering on the man's face. "All right, well, stay safe and keep the speed down," he said, his words sounding more like a suggestion than an order. He had hoped the man would show some sign of discomfort, a reaction to the situation, but nothing came. The driver nodded, giving a small but polite smile in return. He didn't say anything more, just waited patiently as Jameson stepped back from the car. Jameson hesitated for a moment, still unsure of whether to continue the stop or let the man go. He had no solid reason to keep him, but his instincts were telling him that something about this situation wasn't right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the nagging feeling didn't go away. As the driver started to roll up his window, the officer took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort. Maybe it was nothing, but maybe it was more than just a simple traffic stop. As the driver began to roll his window up, Officer Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The man's calmness was unsettling, but there was more to it than just that. Jameson had seen many drivers during his years of service, and he had learned to read people, to sense when something wasn't quite right. But the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. There was nothing overtly wrong with the man. His car wasn't unusual, and he had handed over all the necessary papers without hesitation. So why did the officer feel like there was more to this encounter than met the eye? He stood there for a moment, watching the man as he prepared to drive away. It wasn't just the man's composure that bothered him. It was the way he seemed to be holding something back. He didn't seem like someone caught off guard or someone who was worried about a ticket. It was almost as if he had expected this stop to happen. Jameson had seen people nervous, upset, or trying to explain themselves, but this driver didn't show any of that. The officer shook his head slightly, trying to push the feeling aside. Just a routine stop, he thought to himself. Nothing more. Yet despite his attempt to brush it off, the curiosity and suspicion still lingered. He had no reason to keep the man detained, but something inside him urged him to dig deeper, to ask just a few more questions. Without really thinking, Officer Jameson walked back to the window just as the driver was about to close it. The man looked up, his expression still calm, and Jameson caught a brief glimpse of the driver's eyes. They were focused, unwavering, and knowing. The officer paused for a moment, his fingers hovering over the window frame. Something was definitely off about this encounter. "Hold on a second," Jameson said, his voice more firm than before. The man's eyes shifted slightly, but he didn't look surprised. Instead, he simply waited for the officer to speak. "Something about this doesn't feel right," Jameson muttered, more to himself than to the man. His mind raced as he thought back to all the encounters he had ever had during his years as a cop. He had dealt with criminals, traffic violators, and even those who had a bit of an attitude. But this was different. The driver wasn't acting like anyone Jameson had ever stopped. The officer's instincts told him that something was hiding beneath the surface. The driver gave a slight nod, still calm and composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely, though there was a subtle edge to his voice now, as if he was tired of the questioning. Jameson hesitated. Was this just a random stop, or was there more going on? He stood there for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. His gut told him that he needed to be more cautious, but he wasn't sure what exactly to look for. Everything seemed so ordinary, so normal. Yet, deep down, Jameson knew this was no ordinary traffic stop. He couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at him. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jameson asked, his voice sounding almost too casual. He was trying to make sense of the situation, but his own words felt more like a test than an actual inquiry. The driver remained silent for a moment, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. Finally, he spoke, his voice as calm and composed as ever. "I'm just passing through," he said, and this time, Jameson noticed a hint of something in the driver's voice. It wasn't fear, but something else. Something that hinted at a deeper connection to the town, to the place they were in now. As the driver spoke, there was something in his tone that made Officer Jameson pause. The words were simple, yet there was an underlying calmness in his voice that suggested he wasn't just passing through like an ordinary person. Jameson had learned to trust his instincts, and something inside him told him there was more to this man than met the eye. It was as if the driver was speaking, as though he knew exactly what was about to happen. Jameson could feel a shift in the air between them, and it only made him more curious. He took a step back from the car and glanced at the man once more, trying to gauge his reaction. The driver remained still, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. His eyes were focused and steady, and despite the tension in the air, there was no sign of discomfort. Jameson had seen a lot of people try to avoid eye contact when they were nervous or guilty, but this man wasn't like them. His eyes didn't shift or dart away. They held steady, like he had nothing to hide. Officer Jameson ran his hand through his hair, unsure of how to proceed. He hadn't expected this kind of response, and it was starting to get under his skin. The driver seemed like he was waiting for something, as if he knew the officer was going to ask the next question. The feeling of unease in Jameson's chest grew stronger with each passing second. After a brief silence, Jameson cleared his throat and spoke again, his voice less certain now. "I've been doing this job long enough to know when something's off," he said. "And right now, something doesn't feel right." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his suspicions. The driver's lips curled slightly into what could almost be called a smile, but it wasn't mocking or condescending. It was subtle, almost as if the man were trying to hide something. A flicker of recognition crossed Jameson's face as he realized that the driver's reaction wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't the reaction of someone caught off guard. It was the reaction of someone who had been in control the whole time. For a split second, Jameson wondered if the driver was playing some sort of game, but he quickly shook off that thought. No, this wasn't a game. This was real. The driver wasn't nervous, wasn't guilty, wasn't even defensive. He was simply waiting for Jameson to come to the realization that something important was about to happen. And then, without warning, the driver slowly reached for the rearview mirror. Jameson watched as the man's hand moved calmly toward the mirror. It was a simple gesture, but something about it sent a ripple of tension through the officer. The driver didn't seem like he was trying to fix the mirror. And for a moment, Jameson wondered if the man was about to do something else entirely. But then, the driver casually adjusted the mirror to a better angle, and Jameson's eyes locked onto something hanging from the mirror, a shiny badge that caught the streetlight. At first, Jameson thought it was just another decoration, but as the light reflected off the metal, he could make out the words engraved on it. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the familiar letters and the insignia that read Police Chief. His breath caught in his throat. The man he had just pulled over wasn't just any driver. He was the chief of police. For a split second, time seemed to slow down as the weight of the discovery settled in. Jameson's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He had been so focused on his own suspicions, so convinced that something was wrong, that he hadn't even considered the possibility that he was dealing with someone so important, someone who was far beyond his level in the police force. The realization hit him hard, and for a moment, he didn't know what to do or say. The driver, now revealed as the chief, didn't react to the officer's stunned silence. Instead, he simply sat there, watching Jameson with the same composed expression, as though he had known this moment would come. It was as if the chief had been waiting for Jameson to put the pieces together, all along. For a moment, Officer Jameson just stood there, staring at the badge hanging from the rearview mirror. His heart raced as the reality of the situation slowly sank in. The man he had just stopped, the calm and composed driver, wasn't just an ordinary citizen. He was the police chief. The very person Jameson had been working under for years, the one who led the department, was sitting right in front of him. The shock of the discovery left him momentarily speechless. His mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. The chief didn't seem fazed at all. He simply watched Jameson, his expression as calm as ever, with no hint of anger or annoyance at being pulled over. In fact, he seemed almost amused. But there was no time for Jameson to dwell on the chief's reaction. He knew he had to say something to acknowledge the discovery, but his thoughts were scattered, unsure of what the right thing to say was. Jameson cleared his throat, trying to steady his breath, and took a small step back, his hand still holding the papers he had taken from the man. "I didn't realize." He trailed off, his voice faltering. He was struggling to find the words, but his instincts kicked in. "I didn't know it was you, sir," he said finally, his voice somewhat stiff but respectful. He could feel the weight of the chief's gaze on him, and it made him uncomfortable, as if he were being measured. The chief remained silent for a moment, his eyes still fixed on the officer. Finally, with a slight nod, he spoke. "You didn't need to know, Jameson," he said calmly. "I'm just a man driving home like anyone else." The simplicity of the chief's words only added to the tension. It was as if he was trying to brush the situation off, to make it feel like it was no big deal. But Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than the chief was letting on. There had been something about the way the driver acted that made him feel uneasy, something beyond the discovery of his identity. "You weren't worried?" Jameson blurted out, unable to stop himself. "I mean, you knew I'd pull you over eventually, but you didn't even seem surprised." The chief looked at him for a long moment before giving a small smile. It wasn't a smirk, but it was something that made Jameson feel like he had just been part of a larger picture he couldn't yet see. The chief's eyes softened as he leaned back slightly in his seat. "Why would I be surprised?" The chief asked simply. "I've been pulled over before, and I'll be pulled over again, just like anyone else. Titles don't change that. I'm still a person, and I still follow the same rules everyone else does." Jameson was taken aback. He had expected a defensive reaction, maybe a lecture or even some form of reprimand. But the chief's response was unexpected, calm, almost philosophical. It was as though he didn't take himself as seriously as Jameson had thought. The officer took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. He was still unsure of where this conversation was heading, but it was clear that the chief wasn't upset, nor was he demanding special treatment. "Well, Jameson started, but words escaped him. He didn't know what to say now. The tension had shifted from suspicion to confusion, and he found himself feeling embarrassed, even foolish for not recognizing the man sooner. The chief hadn't been rude or harsh. In fact, he had been entirely composed, even understanding of the situation. "I didn't mean to make things awkward," Jameson finally said, feeling the need to address the uncomfortable silence that had settled between them. "I just didn't expect this." The chief nodded again, his expression still calm. "I understand, Jameson," he said, his voice steady. "But I want you to remember something. Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is how you learn from them, and how you handle them when you find yourself in a position where you have to make a choice." Jameson felt a weight in his chest. There was something in the chief's words, a lesson in humility and responsibility. The encounter wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about something bigger, something the chief had purposely chosen to teach him. The officer wasn't sure he fully understood what was going on, but he knew this wasn't just a coincidence. There was a reason why this stop had happened, and it had everything to do with who he was as a person. as a professional. The chief leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence that had stretched on between them. "I've been watching you, Jameson," he said, "and I think you have potential, but you need to see beyond the surface. You need to challenge your assumptions, not just about others, but about yourself." Jameson's mind raced again, the weight of the chief's words sinking in. He had been taught to follow the rules, to stick to what was easy, what was expected. But now, standing here, faced with this unexpected lesson, he realized that there was so much more he needed to learn. And the chief was giving him the opportunity to grow, to see the world, and his job, through a different lens. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound as Officer Jameson and Chief Anderson sat in the stillness. The exchange had shifted from a routine traffic stop to something deeper, something more personal. Jameson's heart was still racing from the shock of recognizing the chief, but now there was a new kind of tension between them, one that had nothing to do with the traffic violation. The chief had opened the door to a conversation Jameson wasn't prepared for, and he wasn't sure what direction it was going to take. "Why are you doing this, sir?" Jameson finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. It wasn't a question of doubt, but of curiosity. The chief's words had carried weight, and Jameson couldn't ignore the underlying meaning. Why had the chief chosen this moment to address him like this? Why now? Chief Anderson leaned back in his seat, eyes never leaving Jameson's face. His calm expression didn't waver, but there was something more to it now. He was no longer just the superior officer or the person in charge of the department. He seemed like a mentor, someone offering guidance in a way that Jameson had never experienced before. "I'm not just here to teach you a lesson about following the rules, Jameson," the chief said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "This is about understanding something far more important than just obeying orders or enforcing the law." Jameson felt a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure what the chief meant, but the weight of his words suggested something significant was about to be revealed. The officer had always prided himself on following the rules, on doing what was expected. It was how he had been trained, how he had been shaped by his experiences in the force. But now, standing in the presence of the chief, it felt as though everything he had believed was being questioned. "I know you think you're just here to do a job, to keep the peace," the chief continued, his voice steady and calm. "But there's more to this work than that. You see, being a part of this force isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about understanding people. It's about seeing beyond the surface, beyond the uniforms, beyond the badges. It's about understanding who they really are." Jameson's mind raced as the chief spoke. This wasn't just a lecture about police work. It was something deeper, something more philosophical. The chief was challenging his entire perspective on the job, on life, and on how he viewed the people he encountered every day. Jameson had always followed the rules, but now he was being asked to reconsider what those rules really meant. "You see, Jameson," the chief said, leaning forward slightly, "the job is more than just stopping people for speeding or arresting those who break the law. It's about helping people see the truth of who they are. It's about making sure that people are treated with fairness and dignity, no matter who they are. And that means understanding where they come from, understanding their struggles, and seeing beyond the stereotypes we all carry." Jameson was silent, absorbing the chief's words. The chief wasn't just talking about law enforcement. He was talking about humanity, about understanding and empathy. It was a lesson Jameson had never really thought about before, but now it seemed to change everything. "I've seen you, Jameson," the chief said softly, "and I've seen how you handle yourself. But I want you to take a step back and really think about what kind of officer you want to be. Do you just want to follow the rules, or do you want to make a difference? Do you want to serve people, or do you want to just enforce the law? It's a choice, and it's a hard one, but the difference it makes is bigger than you think." The weight of the chief's words sank in. It was more than just a career. It was a responsibility. Jameson had always seen his role as a protector of the law, but now he was beginning to understand that protecting the law was only one part of the equation. The other part was about being a part of the community, understanding the people he was meant to serve, and using his position to help them, not just to police them. "You've been doing your job the way you were trained to," the chief said, his voice gentle now. "But there's so much more you can do if you really understand what it means to be a part of this community. It's not just about stopping cars or writing tickets. It's about connecting with people, seeing them as more than just suspects or criminals, and helping them when they need it." Jameson felt his mind shift as the chief spoke. The idea that law enforcement could be about empathy and understanding was foreign to him, but as the chief's words sank in, he felt a change inside him. It wasn't just about enforcing the rules anymore. It was about something bigger, something more human. For the first time in a long while, Jameson felt the weight of the badge he wore in a different way. It wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a symbol of trust, of responsibility, and of the choice he had to make every day. The chief had given him a glimpse into a new way of seeing the world, a way that might make him a better officer, a better person. The silence between them stretched out again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. Jameson's thoughts were racing, and he knew that his perspective had just shifted. The night had started as a routine traffic stop, but now it felt like a turning point in his life. And for the first time, he wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. It was going to be a journey worth taking. The silence between Officer Jameson and Chief Anderson felt different now. The weight of the conversation lingered in the air, and Jameson could tell that the chief wasn't finished with his lesson. The things the chief had said earlier were still echoing in his mind, and Jameson felt an odd mixture of confusion and realization. He had always thought he knew what it meant to be an officer: follow the rules, enforce the law, protect the community. But the chief had just opened a door to something bigger, something deeper. And for the first time, Jameson felt like he was standing at a crossroads. The chief's voice broke the stillness again. "Jameson, I know this is a lot to take in. It's not easy to look at things differently, especially when you've been trained to see the world a certain way. But you're not alone in this. Everyone makes mistakes, and everyone has room to grow. It's how we handle those moments that defines us." Jameson sat up a little straighter. The chief wasn't just talking about his job. He was talking about life itself. He could feel the sincerity in the chief's words, and it made him think back to all the times he had been too quick to judge, to assume things about people before getting to know them. He realized now that he had been so focused on rules and procedure that he hadn't always paid attention to the bigger picture. "I know it's not easy," the chief continued, his voice steady. "But I'm asking you to be better, not just for the department, but for yourself. Don't just follow the rules because they're there. Follow them because you believe they're right. And when you make mistakes, when you slip up, don't just brush them aside. Learn from them. Grow from them." Jameson nodded slowly. He had been so focused on doing things right, on meeting expectations, that he hadn't stopped to think about why he was doing them. Was it because it was the right thing to do, or simply because it was the way things were supposed to be? The chief's words had made him realize that there was so much more to being a good officer than simply enforcing laws. It was about understanding people, showing compassion, and learning from his experiences. The chief leaned forward slightly, his expression still calm but filled with purpose. "You've got a good heart, Jameson. I've seen it in the way you handle yourself, in the way you care about doing the right thing. But you need to stop looking at things with just one lens. The world isn't black and white, and neither is policing. It's about seeing the shades in between and understanding the people you're dealing with." Jameson felt a sense of responsibility settle over him. The chief had always been a respected leader, but hearing him speak like this, so candidly, so honestly, made Jameson realize just how much the chief cared about his officers. It wasn't about control or power. It was about building a team that understood the deeper purpose behind their work. "I appreciate what you're saying," Jameson said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I think I've been so focused on doing things by the book that I missed the bigger picture. I've been looking at my job as just a set of rules to follow instead of something I can make a real difference in." The chief nodded, his expression softening. That's exactly it. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying your best, being honest with yourself, and always striving to do better. People notice when you care. And the difference you make, even in small ways, will add up. For a long moment, Jameson didn't say anything. The chief's words had taken root in his mind, and he found himself thinking about everything he had been doing up until now. He wasn't a bad officer, but he knew now that he could be better. He could do more than just follow orders. He could be a leader, a guide, someone who made a real impact on the people he served. Finally, the chief spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. I'm proud of you, Jameson. You're going to do great things. Just remember, it's not about perfection. It's about progress. Take everything you've learned today and use it to be the officer and the person you want to be. Jameson felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. The chief had given him a gift today, not just a lesson in law enforcement, but a lesson in life. As he looked at the chief, he felt a newfound sense of purpose. He wasn't just doing a job. He was part of something bigger, something meaningful. As the chief shifted in his seat, preparing to leave, Jameson realized that this night would stay with him forever. It wasn't just a chance encounter, it was a turning point. A chance to grow, to be better, and to make a difference in ways he had never imagined before. Thank you, sir, Jameson said, his voice steady but filled with appreciation. I won't forget this. The chief gave him one last look, his expression warm with understanding. I know you won't, Jameson. I have no doubt you'll make a difference. With that, the chief started his car and drove away, leaving Jameson standing in the quiet night, feeling like he had just taken his first step into a new chapter of his life. The quiet hum of the night surrounded Officer Jameson as he stood there, watching Chief Anderson's car disappear into the distance. His mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. What had started as a routine traffic stop had turned into a pivotal moment in his life. He felt the weight of the conversation lingering in the air, but more than that, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced before. Jameson took a deep breath, standing in the stillness of the night, letting the cool air clear his thoughts. The chief's words echoed in his mind, each one resonating with more meaning than he had expected. He had always thought that being a good officer meant following the rules and making sure everyone obeyed the law. But now, after hearing the chief's lesson, he realized that his job wasn't just about rules. It was about people, about understanding them, about seeing beyond the surface. As the minutes passed, Jameson reflected on his career. He had joined the force with a sense of duty, eager to protect and serve. But somewhere along the way, he had gotten caught up in the routine of it all. He had become so focused on doing things by the book that he had forgotten to truly connect with the people he was supposed to be serving. He had never stopped to think about what it really meant to be a police officer. The chief had opened his eyes to something bigger, something that went beyond the badge and the uniform. It was about empathy. It was about seeing people for who they were, not just their actions. It was about being a part of the community and making a real difference, no matter how small the gesture. Jameson realized that he had the power to change the way he approached his job, to change the way he saw the world. And that was something that could make all the difference. The sound of footsteps on the pavement brought Jameson back to the present. He turned to see his fellow officers walking past, heading back to their cars. They gave him curious glances, wondering why he was still standing by the side of the road, lost in thought. Jameson gave them a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that everything was all right. The chief's words were still fresh in his mind, but now, Jameson felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had always respected the chief, but now that respect had grown into something deeper. He understood now why the chief was so respected by everyone in the department. It wasn't just because of his position or his experience. It was because of the way he saw the world. The chief understood the importance of being human, of being compassionate, and of leading with integrity. As Jameson walked back to his car, He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. He still had a lot to learn, and he knew that his work was far from over. But for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever challenges came his way. He wasn't just a police officer anymore. He was someone who had been given the tools to make a real impact, someone who could lead with both strength and empathy. The next morning, as he entered the precinct, Jameson felt a renewed sense of purpose. The other officers greeted him as usual, but he noticed something had changed inside of him. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was focused, determined to make a difference. He knew that his interactions with the people in the community had to be different now. He had to see them as individuals, not just cases to solve or laws to enforce. As the day went on, Jameson started to put the lessons he had learned into practice. He took extra time with people who seemed troubled. He listened more closely to those who had been pulled over. And he paid attention to the little things that could make someone's day a little easier. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about making the effort, about choosing to make a positive difference. And in that moment, Jameson knew that he was finally on the right path. He was no longer just a man in a uniform. He was an officer who truly understood what it meant to serve. The chief had given him a priceless gift. And now, it was up to Jameson to honor that gift by becoming the kind of officer he had always hoped to be. The lessons of that night would stay with him forever, guiding him through his career and reminding him every day that the true heart of law enforcement wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding the people you were there to protect.